Maybe it's time you step aside, Mother. You're slowing this company down, my son said in front of 12 board members, 3 senior executives, and the full legal team. The words hung in the glass-walled boardroom like a verdict already decided, and for a moment I could hear nothing but the soft hum of the air conditioning and the faint traffic 30 floors below on Madison Avenue. I folded my hands on the polished walnut table and let him finish. Daniel stood at the head of the room where his father once stood, remote in hand, a projection of quarterly forecasts glowing behind him. He was confident, polished, 45 years old in a tailored navy suit that cost more than my first car. The slide behind him read Strategic Realignment for Sustainable Growth, but everyone in that room understood what this was really about. It was about me. I am Margaret Whitmore, 72 years old, co-founder and current chairwoman of Whitmore Holdings. I signed the original incorporation papers in 1985 at a metal desk in a rented office above a hardware store in Queens. I negotiated our first bank loan while 8 months pregnant. I mortgaged our home twice to keep payroll steady during the recession of the early 90s. And now my own son was presenting a plan that quietly erased my influence from the company I built. Daniel clicked to the next slide. A chart appeared, dense with percentages and projected margins. In order to stay competitive, he said smoothly, we need leadership that understands the speed of modern markets. A few of the younger board members nodded. One of them avoided my eyes. I did not interrupt. I did not defend myself. I simply listened as he outlined a restructuring proposal that would consolidate executive authority under the CEO's office, limit what he called legacy oversight, and transition the chair role into a largely ceremonial position. Ceremonial. The word settled over me like dust. I remembered the nights Robert and I spent at our kitchen table running numbers with a calculator that printed on thin curling paper. I remembered Daniel as a boy doing homework in the corner of my office, building little towers out of paper clips while I reviewed contracts. I remembered promising myself that one day he would lead something solid, something built on discipline and respect. Daniel paced slowly as he spoke, his tone measured, almost sympathetic. We honor the foundation laid before us, he continued, glancing briefly in my direction, but progress requires difficult transitions. Someone cleared his throat. The CFO adjusted his glasses. The general counsel kept his face carefully neutral. Daniel finally looked directly at me. It's time to consider retirement, Mother. You've done enough. Retirement. As if this were a hobby I'd picked up in my spare time. As if leadership were a cardigan one simply folds away at the end of the season. I felt the weight of every eye in the room. Some curious. Some uncomfortable. Some calculating. I could have spoken then. I could have reminded them that I still owned the largest block of voting shares. I could have cited the clause embedded in our bylaws that required my signature for any structural amendment. Instead, I reached for my pen and made a small note in the margin of my agenda. Daniel mistook my silence for surrender. I saw it in the faint lift of his chin. We'll be circulating the updated governance documents this afternoon, he said. With everyone's cooperation, we can implement these changes by the next quarter. Cooperation. Such a polite word for displacement. When he concluded, there was restrained applause. Not enthusiastic, but sufficient. The board moved on to minor agenda items as if nothing seismic had just occurred. I contributed where appropriate. I asked 2 precise questions about cash flow exposure. I requested clarification on a supplier contract. My voice did not tremble. My hands did not shake. If anyone expected an emotional display, they were disappointed. When the meeting adjourned, Daniel approached me with a practiced smile. This is about protecting the company, he said quietly. It's what Dad would have wanted. I met his gaze, steady and unblinking. Your father valued discipline, I replied. And accountability. He gave a small nod, as though we were discussing weather, and turned away to greet a venture partner waiting near the door. I remained seated for a moment after the room emptied, looking out at the skyline washed in late afternoon light. 30 years ago, I had stood on this same stretch of Manhattan sidewalk, holding blueprints and hope. Today I sat in a boardroom bearing my family name, having just been publicly diminished by my own son. I did not cry. I did not argue. I simply closed my folder, stood and walked out with the same measured steps I have taken through every crisis of my life. Daniel believed the presentation was the turning point. He was wrong. The turning point would come the next morning. That evening I returned to my penthouse overlooking the East River, and removed my jacket with the same steady movements I used before every important decision. The city below pulsed with its usual urgency. Taxis threading through traffic, office lights flickering on and off as employees went home to families and dinners and ordinary conversations. I poured a single glass of sparkling water, and sat at the small mahogany desk that once belonged to Robert. The surface still held faint scratches from the years when we worked side by side, drafting expansion plans long after midnight. I opened the leather binder containing the company bylaws and turned to Section 7, the clause we had written together after a particularly aggressive acquisition attempt in the early 2000s. It had been my idea to include a founder's protection provision, a veto authority tied not to the chief executive officer, but to the chair who retained majority voting shares. At the time Daniel was in business school in Boston, sending me emails filled with ambition and theories about scaling fast and disrupting markets. I remember smiling at his enthusiasm, proud of his confidence, certain that experience would temper it. Experience does temper many things, but it does not always soften pride. I reviewed the minutes from the previous quarter's board meeting and the language Daniel had referenced in his presentation. He had been careful, almost surgical, in how he framed the governance update. He spoke of modernization, of streamlining, of aligning leadership with contemporary expectations. He never once said removal, but that was the effect. He assumed that I would either protest emotionally or retreat quietly. He did not consider that I might respond procedurally. I placed a call to our general counsel Thomas Green, who has served this company for over 15 years and knows that I do not make late evening calls without reason. His voice was cautious but respectful. I asked him a simple question. Had any amendment to the founder's veto clause been executed with my signature? There was a pause long enough to measure in heartbeats. Then he answered clearly. No. I thanked him and ended the call. I did not feel anger. I felt clarity. In leadership, clarity is more valuable than outrage. I then contacted our corporate secretary and requested a special board session for 8:30 the following morning. The agenda would be brief. No discussion of quarterly forecasts, no debate over marketing budgets. Only governance compliance. I drafted a short written notice invoking my authority as majority shareholder and chairwoman, under the existing charter. The language was precise, neutral, almost clinical. Words have weight when placed correctly. I printed the document and placed it inside my briefcase alongside the original bylaws, and a copy of the shareholder ledger reflecting my controlling interest. I thought about Daniel as a child again, the way he used to sit across from me at this very desk doing arithmetic homework while I explained the difference between revenue and profit. He learned quickly. He has always been intelligent. Intelligence, however, is not the same as judgment. I stood by the window and looked out over the water, remembering the day Robert passed away and Daniel promised he would take care of both the company and me. I believed him. I still believe that somewhere beneath the ambition is the boy who respected discipline. But respect must be demonstrated, not assumed. By 10 o'clock I had reviewed every relevant document twice. I set my alarm for 6 and placed the briefcase by the door. There would be no dramatic confrontation, no raised voices, no public spectacle. There would only be adherence to structure. The next morning, when the board assembled expecting routine matters, they would instead witness something far more fundamental than strategy. They would witness the restoration of order. At 8:25 the next morning I entered the boardroom before anyone else and placed my briefcase at my usual seat at the head of the long walnut table. The skyline beyond the glass walls was pale with early light, the city still stretching awake. I reviewed the documents once more, smoothing each page with deliberate care. Not because I doubted the language but because ritual steadies the mind. One by one the board members arrived, offering polite greetings that carried a hint of curiosity. Special sessions were rare. At 8:30 precisely Daniel walked in, confident as always, carrying a leather portfolio and a tablet. He looked surprised to see the full board present but recovered quickly. I was not aware we had an additional meeting, he said lightly, taking his seat to my right. We do, I replied. And it will be brief. The corporate secretary began recording the session, her expression composed. I opened the meeting by referencing governance compliance under the original charter dated May 1985, and amended only with unanimous consent. I spoke calmly, my tone measured and even. Daniel leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, an almost amused look crossing his face as though he expected a sentimental objection to yesterday's proposal. Instead, I directed Thomas Green to read aloud Section 7, Subsection 4. His voice was steady as he articulated the founder's veto authority, retained by the chairwoman holding majority shares, granting the right to override structural amendments, and to remove executive officers whose actions materially compromise fiduciary balance. The room grew noticeably still. Daniel straightened slightly, the faint smile fading from his expression. "That clause is ceremonial," he said quickly. "It has never been exercised." I met his gaze without raising my voice. "Ceremonial clauses are not written into binding documents," I answered. I then requested the corporate secretary to distribute copies of the current shareholder ledger, reflecting my controlling interest. Papers slid quietly across the table. A few members scanned the percentages, their brows tightening. Daniel shifted in his seat. "Mother, this is unnecessary," he said, attempting a reassuring tone. "We are discussing strategic direction, not authority." I folded my hands before me, the same way I had the previous afternoon. "Strategic direction must respect authority," I replied. I then read from the written notice I had prepared the night before, invoking my rights as majority shareholder and chairwoman under the existing charter to terminate the appointment of the chief executive officer effective immediately due to governance overreach and breach of procedural protocol. The words were clinical, devoid of emotion. They did not need emotion. Daniel stared at me, disbelief registering in the tightening of his jaw. "You cannot be serious," he said quietly. "This will destabilize the company." "What destabilizes a company," I responded, "is leadership that confuses ambition with entitlement." There was no shouting, no dramatic display, only silence thick enough to measure. The board members exchanged cautious glances. Thomas Green confirmed that the clause was valid and enforceable. The corporate secretary documented the motion. I asked for a formal vote acknowledging receipt of the veto. Action. One by one hands were raised. Some reluctantly, some firmly. Daniel remained still, eyes fixed on the table as if recalculating a forecast that no longer made sense. When the final vote was counted, the decision was entered into the record. I turned to my son and spoke in the same tone I used when teaching him multiplication at our kitchen table decades ago. "You built momentum," I said, "but you forgot foundation." He exhaled slowly, anger restrained behind professionalism, and gathered his portfolio. For a moment I saw not the executive but the young man who once asked for advice and listened carefully. Then he stood. The door closed softly behind him. I remained seated, not triumphant, not bitter, simply resolved. Governance had been restored. Order had been preserved. And for the first time in many months the room felt balanced again. The door had barely settled into its frame when the room exhaled in a restrained, collective breath, as though the company itself had been holding tension in its spine. I remained seated for several seconds after Daniel left, allowing the silence to do its work. The board members avoided my eyes at first, studying their folders, adjusting pens, clearing throats that did not need clearing. I understood what they were feeling. It is one thing to discuss governance in theory. It is another to witness a mother remove her own son from the highest office in a company bearing their family name. I closed the binder in front of me and spoke in a tone no different from the one I have used for decades when concluding a quarterly review. "Whitmore Holdings will continue operations without interruption," I said. "Interim executive authority will revert to the chair until a formal selection process is completed." The words were procedural, but beneath them lay 38 years of discipline. Thomas Green nodded, confirming the legality of the transition. The chief financial officer began outlining immediate communication steps to reassure investors and employees. I listened carefully, asking only what was necessary. Stability is not declared through emotion. It is demonstrated through structure. As the meeting adjourned, several members approached me individually. One expressed concern about market reaction. Another quietly admitted he had underestimated my retained authority. I thanked them both without elaboration. When the room finally emptied, I stood and walked to the window. The East River reflected the morning sun in fractured silver lines. For a brief moment, memory overtook strategy. I saw Daniel at age 12, standing beside me at a groundbreaking ceremony for our second manufacturing facility in New Jersey. He wore a hard hat too large for his head and shook hands with contractors as if rehearsing for this very life. I had placed my hand on his shoulder that day and told him leadership was not about being the loudest voice in the room. It was about being the most responsible one. Somewhere along the path between that construction site and this boardroom, responsibility became secondary to momentum. I do not blame ambition. Ambition built this company. But ambition without restraint fractures foundations. I returned to my office, a space lined with framed photographs chronicling decades of growth. In one photograph, Robert and I are seated at a folding table in a cramped office, coffee cups balanced beside stacks of invoices. We look exhausted but resolute. I traced the edge of the frame with my fingertip, not in nostalgia but in acknowledgement. Every expansion, every acquisition, every strategic pivot had been anchored in patience. Daniel had mistaken patience for hesitation. At 11 o'clock, the communications director entered with a draft statement announcing the leadership change. The language was professional, emphasizing continuity and strategic oversight. I adjusted 2 sentences, replacing unexpected transition with charter-based succession. Words matter. They shape perception before emotion has time to interfere. By noon, the news had reached senior managers across all departments. There were no raised voices in the hallways, no dramatic exits. Only quiet conversations and a steady flow of emails confirming operational continuity. I did not seek Daniel out. This was not personal retaliation. It was structural correction. Around 1 o'clock, my assistant informed me that Daniel had cleared his office and left the building. I absorbed the information without visible reaction. There would be time for personal conversations later, when emotion had cooled and perspective had returned. For now, the company required steadiness. I signed 3 pending contracts, reviewed an international supplier agreement, and scheduled a strategy session for the following week. Leadership does not pause for sentiment. Yet as evening approached and the office floor grew quiet, I allowed myself a single private reflection. Removing my son had not been an act of punishment. It had been an act of preservation. Family can coexist with business, but only when respect underpins both. As I gathered my belongings and prepared to leave, I glanced once more at the skyline beyond the glass. The city moved forward without hesitation. So would I. That evening I did not return directly home. Instead, I asked my driver to take the longer route along the river, watching the late sun stretch across the water as if the city itself were exhaling after a long day. I have learned that decisions of consequence require a moment of stillness afterward, not to question them, but to settle into their reality. When I finally entered my penthouse, the quiet greeted me with its familiar steadiness. I placed my briefcase on the same mahogany desk where I had reviewed the bylaws the night before. The room felt unchanged, yet something subtle had shifted. The company would move forward. The governance had been restored. But motherhood does not operate under corporate structure. Around 7:30 my phone rang. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. I let it ring once more than usual before answering. His voice was controlled, almost too controlled. "I suppose congratulations are in order," he said. There was no sarcasm, only tension wrapped in restraint. "This was not a victory," I replied. "It was a correction." He exhaled softly. "You embarrassed me in front of the board." I stood by the window, looking out over the darkening skyline. "You attempted to remove my authority in front of the board," I answered evenly. "Public decisions carry public consequences." There was a pause long enough to reveal the distance between us. "You could have talked to me privately," he said. "I have attempted private conversations for months," I responded. "You chose presentation over dialogue." Silence again. Beneath the executive composure, I could hear the son who once sought approval in every report card and college acceptance letter. "What happens now?" he asked finally. It was the first question he had asked without asserting control. "Now," I said, "you take time to consider the difference between ownership and stewardship." He did not respond immediately. I imagined him somewhere in the city, perhaps in his apartment overlooking Central Park, staring at a skyline that no longer felt entirely his. "You built this," he said quietly. "I know. And you think I tried to take it from you. I think you tried to change its foundation without understanding why it was laid the way it was." I kept my tone calm, not accusatory. Leadership is not proven by humiliation. It is proven by restraint. "You always said growth required risk," he continued. "It does," I agreed. "But risk without consent from those who bear the consequence is not growth. It is disregard." The line remained open, neither of us eager to disconnect first. Finally he spoke again, the sharpness in his voice softened. "I did not expect you to use that clause." "That is precisely why it exists," I replied. "To be used when necessary, not when convenient." After we ended the call, I set the phone down and allowed myself a single quiet breath. Removing him had not diminished my role as his mother, but it had redefined it. I walked to the bookshelf and pulled down an old leather-bound ledger from our earliest years. Inside were handwritten entries of expenses and revenue, notes Robert and I made during lean months when survival was uncertain. I ran my fingers over the faded ink. We built Whitmore Holdings from persistence, not from speed. Daniel inherited scale but not the memory of scarcity. The following morning the market opened with modest fluctuations. Nothing dramatic, nothing catastrophic. Analysts released measured commentary citing strong fundamentals and experienced oversight. Stability once again proved more persuasive than spectacle. By midday I convened a small executive session to outline interim leadership responsibilities. I spoke with clarity and without emotion, reinforcing that this transition was procedural, not personal. The company required focus. Families, however, require reflection. As the afternoon light filtered across my office floor, I understood that the greater challenge would not be managing investors or strategy. It would be rebuilding respect without surrendering authority. Authority can be reclaimed in a single meeting. Respect must be relearned over time. The week that followed unfolded with a calm that surprised even me. Markets respond to uncertainty, not to authority exercised with precision. Our stock price dipped less than 1% before stabilizing, a minor tremor rather than an earthquake. Analysts cited continuity of leadership and the strength of long-term contracts. Stability once again proved more persuasive than charisma. I arrived at the office each morning before 7, reviewing operational reports with the same discipline that shaped the company in its earliest days. There was no need for sweeping changes. The structure was sound. It had only required reinforcement. Daniel did not contact me again for 3 days. When he finally requested a meeting, he did so formally through my assistant as any former executive might. I approved the request without hesitation and scheduled it for Friday at 10 o'clock in my private office rather than the boardroom. There are conversations meant for public record, and others meant for private understanding. When he entered that morning, he looked less like a chief executive officer, and more like the son who once waited outside my office after school. He wore a simple gray suit without the bold tie he favored during presentations. He did not sit until I gestured toward the chair across from my desk. "I have had time to think," he began. His tone lacked the sharp edges I had grown accustomed to. I closed the folder in front of me and gave him my full attention. "Thinking is useful," I said quietly, "especially when it follows consequence." He nodded once, absorbing the statement rather than reacting to it. "I believed I was protecting the company from stagnation," he said. "You were protecting it from memory," I replied. He frowned slightly. "Memory? The memory of what it took to build this," I said, resting my hand lightly on the leather ledger beside me. "You inherited expansion. You did not inherit scarcity." Silence settled between us, not hostile but reflective. "You think I am reckless," he said. "I think you are impatient," I answered. "Impatience can be corrected. Disrespect cannot be ignored." He exhaled slowly, the weight of those words finding their place. "I should not have presented that proposal the way I did," he admitted. It was not a dramatic apology, but it was honest. "No," I agreed. "You should not have." I allowed the acknowledgement to stand without embellishment. Leadership lessons do not require lectures. They require clarity. What happens now? He asked again, though this time the question carried humility rather than strategy. I rose from my chair and walked to the window overlooking the river. The city moved below us with quiet persistence. Now, I said, turning back toward him, you step away from the executive seat and learn the discipline of oversight without authority. His brow tightened. You want me to remain involved? I want you to understand governance from the outside, I replied. Serve on a committee. Review risk assessments. Observe how decisions are weighed when you are not the one making them. He considered this, the ambition in him recalibrating. You are not removing me from the company, he said slowly. I removed you from a role, I corrected. Not from responsibility. There is a difference. I returned to my desk and slid a document toward him outlining a structured transition plan. It was not punitive. It was corrective. He read it carefully, then looked up at me. You always plan 3 steps ahead, he said quietly. Experience teaches that foresight is less expensive than repair, I replied. A faint, reluctant smile touched his expression, the first sign of familiarity since the board meeting. I underestimated you, he said. That was unwise, I answered, though my tone softened slightly. The meeting lasted less than 40 minutes. When he stood to leave, there was no dramatic embrace. No theatrical reconciliation. Only a mutual understanding that authority had been clarified and respect had begun its return. As the door closed behind him, I allowed myself a measured breath. Leadership within a company can be enforced by charter. Leadership within a family requires steadiness. I resumed my work, reviewing contracts and scheduling strategy sessions, aware that rebuilding perspective takes longer than reclaiming power. But foundations once reinforced do not fracture easily. The following Monday I arrived at the office before sunrise, the sky still a muted gray above the East River, and for the first time in years I sensed a different rhythm within the building. Not tense, not uncertain, but recalibrated. Authority, once clarified, has a way of restoring quiet order. I walked through the executive floor without entourage, without announcement, acknowledging employees with the same brief nod I have given for decades. Stability is communicated in small gestures. Daniel had begun attending risk oversight meetings as outlined in the transition plan. He arrived on time, listened more than he spoke, and asked questions that were no longer framed as directives. I observed from the head of the table, offering guidance only when necessary. The shift in him was subtle but measurable. In leadership, transformation does not appear as dramatic change. It appears as restraint. During one session reviewing capital exposure in our European division, he paused before responding to a proposal and said, "What are the long-term implications if demand slows by 10%? It was a simple question, but it reflected patience rather than acceleration. I did not praise him openly. I simply allowed the discussion to unfold. Praise given too quickly can distort progress. Later that week we hosted a scheduled investor briefing. I delivered the opening remarks, outlining our strategic focus on sustainability and measured expansion. When Daniel entered the room, he took a seat among committee members rather than at the podium. Several analysts noticed. I noticed as well. Position signals intent more clearly than speech. After the session concluded, one long-term investor approached me privately. "You handled that transition decisively," he said. "Companies falter when founders hesitate." I responded with a measured smile. "Foundations exist to bear weight," I said, "not to decorate annual reports." That afternoon Daniel requested access to archived financial reports from the early years of the company. I directed him to the storage room adjacent to my office where old binders are kept in labeled boxes. I watched him carry 2 of them to the conference table and open them carefully, as if discovering a forgotten language. He studied the thin margins, the handwritten notes in blue ink, the months where revenue barely covered payroll. "I never realized how close it was in the beginning," he said quietly. "You were not meant to," I replied. "Parents shield children from uncertainty until they are ready to understand it." He closed the binder slowly, absorbing the weight of that truth. "I thought scale meant security," he said. "Scale amplifies whatever foundation exists," I answered. "If the foundation is disciplined, scale strengthens it. If it is careless, scale exposes it." He nodded once, The confidence that once bordered on arrogance now tempered by comprehension. That evening, as the office lights dimmed and employees departed in steady waves, I remained at my desk reviewing a proposal for expansion into renewable materials. Daniel approached my office doorway and paused. "May I offer a perspective?" he asked. It was a small sentence, but it carried more respect than any polished presentation he had delivered months earlier. "You may," I said, gesturing for him to sit. He outlined his thoughts carefully, acknowledging risk and contingency before speaking of growth. I listened without interruption, weighing not only the content but the tone. When he finished, I nodded once. "Draft a revised proposal incorporating those safeguards," I said. "We will review it together." The word "together" did not go unnoticed. As he left, I felt no triumph, no lingering resentment. Authority had been enforced. Respect was being rebuilt. Outside, the city continued its relentless motion, taxis streaming beneath office towers that rise and fall with market cycles. Whitmore Holdings would endure because its leadership understood both expansion and restraint. And within the quiet walls of that office, a son was beginning to understand that stewardship is earned not by standing at the head of the table, but by knowing when to listen. Autumn arrived quietly in Manhattan, carrying with it a crisp edge in the air that sharpened thought and clarified priorities. From my office window, the East River reflected pale gold light, and I found myself measuring time not in quarters but in adjustments. Daniel continued attending committee meetings, and the transformation in him became less subtle. He listened without interrupting. He reviewed projections before challenging them. He began asking our senior managers about operational details he once dismissed as minor. Leadership does not return in dramatic declarations. It returns in disciplined habits. One afternoon, I invited him to join me at a meeting with a long-standing manufacturing partner from Ohio. The factory employs more than 400 people, many of whom have worked with us for over 2 decades. In the past, Daniel focused primarily on margins and expansion metrics. This time, he asked about supply chain resilience and workforce stability. After the meeting ended, our partner shook his hand and said, "You are thinking long-term now." Daniel glanced briefly in my direction before responding, "I am learning to." That acknowledgement mattered more than any apology. Later that week, I convened a strategic planning session with the full executive team. The topic was a potential acquisition in Texas, an opportunity that promised rapid growth but carried regulatory complexity. I deliberately assigned Daniel to lead the due diligence analysis while remaining under committee oversight. Responsibility without unchecked authority creates balance. Over several days, he reviewed contracts, compliance records, and environmental assessments with methodical care. When he presented his findings, he did not recommend immediate expansion. Instead, he outlined risks and suggested a phased approach tied to performance benchmarks. The room responded with measured approval. I listened quietly, recognizing the shift not only in his language but in his posture. He no longer leaned forward to dominate the table. He sat upright, attentive, aware of the collective weight of decision-making. After the session concluded, we walked together down the executive corridor. Employees greeted us without tension. Stability had become visible. "You could have replaced me permanently," he said as we approached my office. His voice was steady, not defensive. "I could have," I replied. "But removal teaches only consequence. Restoration teaches responsibility." He absorbed that distinction in silence. In the weeks that followed, I gradually reintroduced him to select leadership functions, always with transparent oversight. Authority, once reclaimed, is not surrendered lightly. It is transferred deliberately. At a quarterly town hall meeting attended by more than 200 employees, I stood beside him on the stage. I addressed the workforce first, reaffirming our commitment to disciplined growth and ethical governance. Then I invited Daniel to speak. He did not reference past events. He spoke instead about accountability, about learning from seasoned leadership, about protecting the company's legacy while pursuing innovation. His tone carried humility that had not existed months earlier. When the meeting ended, several senior managers approached him with renewed confidence. Respect, once fractured, had begun to mend. That evening, as we rode the elevator down to the lobby, he turned to me and said, "I thought leadership meant speed." I looked at the city lights flickering beyond the glass doors and answered quietly, leadership means endurance. Outside, the air carried the first true chill of the season. The company stood steady. The foundation remained intact. And as I walked toward the waiting car, I understood that power enforced by charter had evolved into something quieter and more lasting. Discipline had corrected ambition. And ambition, tempered by discipline, was finally beginning to resemble stewardship. Winter settled over the city with a quiet authority of its own, the kind that does not announce itself but simply arrives and reshapes the landscape. From my office window, the East River carried sheets of pale gray beneath a low sky, steady and indifferent to human ambition. Months had passed since the Boardroom confrontation, and Whitmore Holdings stood stronger than before. Our quarterly results reflected disciplined growth. Our debt exposure had decreased by 6%, and our new sustainability initiative had secured long-term contracts across 3 states. Stability was no longer a defensive posture. It was a strategy. Daniel now occupied the office he once held, not by assumption but by reaffirmed vote. The board reinstated him after a formal review process, one that required documented oversight and structured accountability. I did not oppose the decision. I supported it. Authority, when restored properly, does not diminish the founder. It validates the system the founder built. On the morning of the reinstatement vote, Daniel entered the boardroom with measured composure. He did not stand at the head of the table until invited. He presented a revised 5-year plan grounded in phased expansion, conservative leverage, and contingency reserves equal to 12 months of operating expenses. He acknowledged past misjudgments without dramatizing them. Growth without discipline is volatility, he said. The sentence carried weight because it was earned. When the board approved his return to the executive seat, there was no applause, only nods of confidence. Later that afternoon he came to my office. He did not close the door behind him. "Thank you," he said simply. I looked at him for a long moment before responding. "You thank the board," I said. "Thank me by remembering what this required." He inclined his head once, not defensively but respectfully. "I will. There are moments in leadership when victory is visible. This was not one of them. This was quieter, more permanent." In the weeks that followed, Daniel led with restraint. He requested my counsel before major announcements, not out of dependency but out of recognition. We debated strategy with candor and without ego. When disagreements arose, they were resolved in conference rooms rather than in spectacle. The employees sensed the difference. Investor calls reflected confidence rather than tension. The culture, once strained, settled into maturity. One evening, long after most of the staff had left, Daniel stood beside me at the window overlooking the city lights. "You could have ended my career," he said softly. "I could have," I replied. "But ending is easy. Correcting is harder." He studied the skyline as though seeing it for the first time. "Why did you choose correction?" he asked. I answered without hesitation. "Because this company was built for endurance. And so was our family." He did not speak immediately. Then he said, "I thought power meant control." I allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Power," I said, "means responsibility." The word lingered between us, simple and exact. As we prepared to leave for the evening, I glanced once more at the framed photograph of Robert in the early years, standing beside a modest sign that bore our company name for the first time. We had built something resilient, not just in structure but in principle. Authority had been challenged. It had been defended. It had been clarified. And in the process, both the company and my son had been strengthened. Outside, snow began to fall in quiet, deliberate flakes, covering the sidewalks and rooftops with a clean, unbroken layer. Foundations remain unseen beneath the surface, but they determine whether what stands above will endure. I turned off the lights in my office and stepped into the corridor, aware that leadership, like winter, does not require noise to assert itself. It requires steadiness. And steadiness, once restored, does not easily fade.